You don't own a single thing in that shanty!
Clint Harrow shouted, his voice echoing through the courthouse hallway. Grant stood still, court papers in one hand, his father's rusted tin box in the other. Anita pointed at him.
Your father hid family property, and now you're trying to steal it.
Outside the courtroom door, Rook waited beside a deputy, silent and watchful. 6 years ago, they laughed at Thomas for keeping a condemned shack. Now they wanted whatever Rook had found behind that wall, before anyone else understood why Thomas had protected it for so long. But Thomas Harrow had left one final answer. They used to say Thomas Harrow had bought the ugliest thing in Bracken County and called it land. A rotting shanty at the end of Heron's Cut, 3 miles past the last real road, leaning toward the salt water as if even the building was tired of standing. For 6 years, Grant Harrow had let them say it. He had let his cousins laugh about it at the funeral lunch, let old men at the feed store shake their heads over it, let strangers call it Thomas's rotten mistake without answering a word. It was easier that way. A man could defend only so many things before he started sounding like he was begging people to understand him. Grant was 42 years old the morning the machine shop closed. The rain had started before dawn, a thin March rain that made everything look poorer than it was. He sat behind the wheel of his faded blue pickup in the gravel lot, his last pay envelope folded on the seat beside him, and counted what would remain after gas, phone, and the room he could no longer afford past Friday. $100, give or take a few coins in the ashtray. Rook, his gray-white German shepherd, lay across the passenger seat with one ear lifted, his dark eyes watching Grant without asking the questions people never knew how to ask. Grant had been in the Army Corps of Engineers long enough to know how to read a bridge by the way it trembled, a road by the way water gathered under it, a man by the way he stopped speaking when pride ran out. He had built things under pressure. He had repaired things other people had already given up on. But civilian life had a quieter kind of collapse. No explosion, no alarm, just the slow shrinking of room. Paychecks, calls returned too late, and mornings when a man woke with his boots beside the bed and no place worth walking toward. The shop owner, Dale Whitcomb, had apologized with his cap in both hands, and that almost made it worse. Kindness did not keep lights on. Grant thanked him because he had been raised to thank people, then carried his toolbox to the truck while rain darkened the shoulders of his coat. Rook had stood in the open door, silent, waiting. That was what Rook did. He waited without making a man feel watched. By noon, Grant was back in the room above Mrs. Tallow's closed bait shop, packing what little he owned into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box soft at the corners. At the bottom of the closet, beneath winter socks and old service papers, he found his father's square tin box. He almost left it there. Then Rook nudged it with his nose, once, gently, as if reminding him that some things did not stop mattering just because they hurt to touch. Inside were tax receipts, a yellowed county deed, a rusted key that probably opened nothing anymore, and a folded note in Thomas Harrow's stiff block handwriting. Grant had read it before. He had hated it before. Still his thumb slowed over the creases as he opened it again. Don't sell the shanty. Some places remember men better than people do. That was all. No explanation. No apology for the $350 Thomas had spent on a condemned shack when his own truck needed brakes. No reason why a widowed, stubborn mechanic would drive out to Heron's Cut alone and come back smelling of marsh wind and old wood. Grant remembered being angry about that. He remembered asking his father what was out there, and Thomas looking at him with tired eyes, as if the answer was too large for the kitchen they stood in. Someday, he had said, but someday had ended in a hospital room with machines humming softly and Grant holding a paper cup of coffee he never drank. Now the note lay in his hand, and the room around him felt suddenly temporary, as if the walls had already decided he was leaving. Rook sat by the door. Outside, rain ticked against the window. Grant looked at the deed again. Heron's Cut, one shanty, one strip of marshland almost no one wanted. One promise he had kept mostly because breaking it would have felt like arguing with a dead man. He did not feel hope. Hope was too expensive for a morning like that. What he felt was the hard, plain math of having nowhere else to go. By late afternoon, the pickup was loaded. The room was swept clean because Grant could not leave a place dirty, even when the place was done with him. He locked the door, placed the key under Mrs. Tallow's flower pot as she had asked, and stood for a moment under the awning while Rook waited beside his leg. The dog's fur was damp at the edges. His eyes were fixed east, toward the flat road that would eventually give way to marsh and shell. Grant slid the folded note into his jacket pocket. Then he opened the truck door for Rook, climbed in after him, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before catching. He told himself he was only going out there to see if the roof still held. Just one night, maybe two, long enough to think, long enough to decide what a man did after the last ordinary door closed behind him. But as the pickup rolled out of Bracken Harbor and the smell of salt began to rise through the rain, Grant felt the note against his chest like a small, stubborn weight. For the first time in 6 years, his father's impossible sentence did not sound like madness. It sounded like a door he had been too tired to open. Grant and Rook drove out to Heron's Cut the next morning, under a sky the color of old pewter. Bracken Harbor fell away behind them, one familiar piece at a time. First the bait shop with its dark windows. Then the gas station where Grant had put in $20 and tried not to look at the needle. Then the last mailbox, standing crooked at the end of a paved road that had once mattered more than it did now. After that, the county road narrowed, cracked, and gave up. Blacktop became packed dirt. Packed dirt became sand-veined with grass. Then, just as Thomas Harrow's deed had promised, the road turned into a pale strip of crushed oyster shell, running straight through the marsh as if somebody had laid a bone across the water. The pickup tires crunched over it, sharp and dry, a sound Grant felt through the floorboards. The passenger window would not close all the way, so the wind came in low and cold, carrying the smell of salt, wet mud, dead grass, and something mineral underneath, like the breath of old water. Brown cordgrass bent under the wind, and narrow cuts of tidewater flashed silver between the reeds. Rook did not sleep. That was the first thing Grant noticed. On long drives, the dog usually stretched out with his nose tucked near the door, waking only when the truck slowed. But this morning Rook sat upright, his ears lifted, his muzzle pointed toward the end of the shell road. He was not excited. He was not afraid. He was listening in that deep, still way he had, the way he listened some nights when Grant woke before the dream had fully let go of him. The shanty appeared slowly, not all at once. First Grant saw the old pilings in the water, leaning at odd angles like a row of men too tired to stand straight. Then the sagging line of a roof. Then the building itself, long and low, crouched at the far end of Heron's Cut, where the marsh narrowed into a point. Weather had taken most of the color from it. The cypress boards were gray as ash. The tin roof was rusted dark, peeled back at one corner, and one side of the structure leaned toward the water with a stubborn sadness that made Grant think of an old man refusing help. The windows on the leeward wall were broken black holes. A county warning notice, curled at the edges and pale from sun, hung crooked beside the door. Grant stopped the truck and left the engine running a moment longer than he needed to. Grant sat there with Rook beside him, both of them staring through the windshield. So this was what his father had guarded. This was the promise that had followed him through 6 years of unpaid taxes, family jokes, and his own quiet resentment. A shack nobody could live in, a thing even the tide seemed to be taking back by inches. For the first time in a long while, Grant let himself feel angry at Thomas, not loud anger, not clean anger, but the tired kind that sits behind the ribs. His father had known how hard things were. He had known Grant was not built for riddles, and still he had left him this leaning ruin and a sentence about places remembering men. Grant shut off the engine. The sudden quiet made the marsh seem larger. He stepped out, and the wind pressed his jacket against his chest. Rook jumped down after him and stood close to his left knee, head low, nose working. The closer Grant walked, the less simple the shanty became. The roof was bad, yes. The siding had gaps wide enough for weather. The little dock had given up years ago, leaving only wet pilings and a few boards green with age. But the foundations surprised him. Low stones, hand-laid and settled deep, still held their line. The main sill beams were cypress, old and hard. Grant crouched and pressed his thumb against one, expecting softness. The wood did not give. He moved along the wall, reading damage the way he had once read temporary bridges and flood-worn roads. A dead building had a certain feel. This one did not feel dead. It felt neglected. There was a difference, and his hands knew it before his mind wanted to admit it. The padlock on the door had rusted into a single orange lump. Thomas's key, if it had ever fit, would not fit now. Grant found a length of iron pipe near the collapsed skiff shed, worked it through the hasp, and pulled until the old screws tore loose with a low wooden groan. The door opened inward, and the smell that came out made him stop. It was not only damp he expected. This was drier, stranger, layered with linseed oil, dust, old paint, canvas, salt dried into wood, and the closed-up breath of years. Rook slipped past him without a bark. He crossed the room slowly, nails clicking on the floorboards, then stopped at the inland wall where a warped shelf hung beneath an old fishing net stiff with dust. The dog lowered his nose to the boards, drew in a long breath, lifted one paw and scratched once. Then he turned his head and looked at Grant. Grant frowned, stepped closer, and tapped the wall with his knuckles. The sound was not solid. It was hollow, patient, waiting. Grant did not open the wall that afternoon. The hollow sound stayed with him, and Rook kept glancing toward the warped shelf, as if the boards had whispered something only a dog could hear. But daylight was thinning, the wind was sharpening, and a man with nowhere else to sleep had to think first about staying dry. So Grant did what he knew how to do. He worked. He dragged broken boards out through the door and stacked them where the tide would not reach. He pulled a sheet of plastic from the back of the pickup and cut it with his pocket knife to cover the window holes on the leeward side. He found an old tarp folded behind a pile of crab floats and tied it over the peeled corner of the roof with rope stiff from salt. It was not a repair any proud carpenter would sign his name to. But by evening the worst of the wind no longer walked straight through the room. Rook followed every step, never crowding him, never wandering far. His steady shape passing in and out of the low light like a quiet thought Grant could not shake. Only when the shanty had stopped shivering around him did Grant really look at what stood inside it. The room was not empty. It had never been empty. A long workbench ran along the inland wall, its top worn into shallow valleys where hands had worked the same motions for years, maybe decades. Dust lay over everything, but order still showed beneath it. Faint outlines marked the boards above the bench, shapes where tools had once hung. Long knives, gouges, rasps, a draw knife with handles at both ends. A foot-powered grindstone sat in the corner, its wheel filmed gray. There were dried paints, linseed oil. curled sandpaper and small blocks of wood set aside in careful rows. On the shelves were birds, not real birds, not toys, not decorations for a mantle. Decoys. Some were barely roughed out, with only the slope of a back and the hint of a head. Some had been hollowed from beneath and fitted with thin bottom boards. A few still carried dull patches of old paint, green and brown and black softened by time. Grant lifted one unfinished duck and felt its balance before he understood it. The belly had been carved out cleanly, the bottom board fitted tight, the head set at an angle that made the thing seem alert even without eyes. He had spent enough of his life fixing machines, boats, and temporary structures to recognize work made by someone who did not guess. Whoever carved this knew water, wind, and how a small object had to ride a moving surface without turning over. The thought unsettled him. A place the county had marked as worthless had once held a man's exactness, his patience, maybe his whole life. Rook's nails clicked behind him. Grant turned and saw the dog beside the inland wall again, nose low near the shelf. This time, when Grant followed, he noticed what he had missed before, a folded canvas chair tucked under the lowest plank, half hidden by a torn net. He pulled it free, and the breath went out of him. The chair was his father's. Not like his father's, his father's. The left arm had been repaired with black tape. Grant remembered that tape from summers spent waiting in boatyards, while Thomas worked late. On the chair lay a faded canvas coat, stiff at the cuffs, smelling faintly of dust and old rain. Grant touched the collar and saw the initials T.H. stitched inside in his mother's small, neat hand. In one pocket he found a pencil worn almost to nothing and a folded scrap of paper. Roofing tin, cypress board, hinges, lamp oil, window putty. The list was written in Thomas Harrow's square, stubborn hand. Grant stood very still. The old anger that had ridden with him all the way to Heron's Cut did not vanish, but it changed shape. It lost its teeth. His father had not bought the shanty and forgotten it. He had come here, sat here, planned repairs. Maybe stood exactly where Grant stood now, looking at the same wall, breathing the same closed air, trying to decide how to tell his son something he had carried too long alone. On the bench near a coffee stain gone dark with age, Grant found a dented steel thermos. Thomas had taken that thermos everywhere. Grant put his palm around it and felt, absurdly, as if the metal might still remember the warmth of his father's hand. For a long moment, he could not move. He saw Thomas not as the silent old man who had left behind a burden, but as a man working after hours in a forgotten room, saving receipts, making lists, running out of time. How much had Grant missed because he had mistaken quiet for emptiness? How much had Thomas failed to say because Harrow men had always treated tenderness like a tool they did not know how to hold? Rook scratched the wall again, harder this time, a short dry drag of claws against painted wood. Grant wiped his face with the heel of his hand and crouched. He took down the lowest shelf carefully, board by board, and the wall behind it gave up its disguise. Most of the tongue and groove boards ran straight from floor to ceiling, but one section did not match. The bead line sat a fraction too high. The paint was the same color, but smoother. Grant pressed along the edge and felt it move. Not much, just enough. A panel. Hidden so well a man could live beside it for years and never know, unless a dog listened, or a son finally came back. Grant left the panel alone until morning, though leaving it alone did not mean forgetting it. That night, the shanty seemed to breathe around him. Rain moved over the patched tin roof in uneven whispers, sometimes soft as fingers, sometimes sharp enough to make Rook lift his head from the blanket by the door. The tide came in after midnight, filling the cuts around Heron's Cut with a slow, dark sound, and the old building answered with tiny ticks and sighs from its beams. Grant lay on his bedroll, with his jacket folded beneath his head, one hand resting on his father's note, the other near Rook's warm shoulder. Don't sell the shanty. Some places remember men better than people do. He had read those words so many times they no longer felt written on paper. They felt written somewhere under his ribs. For 6 years, he had treated them like an inconvenience. One more unfinished sentence from a father who had never been easy to reach. But now the coat, the thermos, the pencil list, and that hidden panel had made the sentence heavier. Not clearer. He was not ready to call it clear. But heavier. As dawn came pale through the plastic-covered windows, Grant rose without feeling rested. Rook was already awake, sitting beside the inland wall, not pawing at it now, just waiting. That patience unsettled Grant more than barking would have. He made coffee on a small camp stove, drank it too hot, and stood for a while with the chipped mug in his hand, looking at the panel as if it were looking back. Then he gathered what he needed: his pocket knife, a flat screwdriver, a short pry bar from his toolbox, and a rag to keep his hands from slipping. The panel had been made by someone careful. That was the first thing he learned. It did not give itself up to force. The edges had been sanded smooth, painted to match the surrounding boards, and fitted so tight that even the years had not opened a crack wide enough for daylight. Grant worked the knife into the upper seam and felt old paint flake away in thin curls. He moved slowly. The Army had taught him plenty about speed when speed mattered, but old wood did not respect speed. Old wood respected patience. He eased the screwdriver into the line, then the pry bar, barely lifting, listening for the difference between a panel loosening and a board splitting. At last, something inside gave a dry, reluctant pop. The sound was small, but in that closed room it seemed to travel through everything. Rook stood, ears forward. Grant set the pry bar down and pulled with both hands. The whole section came away lighter than he expected. A fitted door of cypress with hidden hinges darkened by age. Behind it was a narrow wall cavity, dry as a drawer and black beyond the reach of morning light. There was no cash, no gold, no easy reward waiting in the dark. At first, Grant saw only shapes, bundles wrapped in oilcloth gone amber at the folds, small wooden boxes, a canvas bag tied with a leather thong, and a black ledger standing upright at the back, as if it had been placed there last by hands that knew exactly what they were saving. The air that came from the cavity was old but not rotten. It smelled of cedar, paper, linseed oil, and time kept away from weather. Rook sat beside him and did not move closer. He had brought Grant here, and now he seemed to understand that the rest belonged to the man. Grant lifted the first bundle and set it on the bench. The cloth cracked softly as he opened it. Inside lay a canvasback decoy, its sloping head painted a deep reddish brown, its body a pale gray that shifted in the morning light. The glass eyes were amber, not bright, but alive in some quiet way. The paint was not smooth. It had been combed into thousands of fine feather lines. Each stroke so patient Grant felt almost embarrassed to touch it with his rough hands. He turned the bird over and found the hollowed belly sealed with a fitted bottom board. The balance weight set so cleanly he could see the maker had understood water the way a good mechanic understood an engine. Under the base, burned into the wood, were 2 letters inside the outline of a wing. SF. He unwrapped another, then another. Small swans, a black duck, thin-legged shorebirds, and a tall heron waited in the dark, each one carved with a patience Grant could feel in his hands. 28 pieces in all, each wrapped separately, each preserved in the dark, while storms, taxes, arguments, funerals, and years passed outside without touching them. Grant did not know what they were worth. Not yet, but he knew they were not junk. No one made things like these by accident. Last, he opened the ledger. The coveter resisted, then sighed back, On the first page in slow, rough writing was a name, Silas Fenwick, 1948. Beneath it, one line sat alone. A decoy is not made to fool the world. It is made to call something lost back home. Grant read it once, then again, and the room changed around him. The shanty was still cold. The roof still leaked somewhere behind him. He still had about $100 and no real plan. But something had shifted. The wall had not given him an answer he could spend. It had given him a question large enough to stand inside. Who was Silas Fenwick? And what had this forgotten place been calling home all these years? Grant meant to read only the first few pages. That was what he told himself while the afternoon faded and the marsh outside turned from pewter to black. He had no lamp worth trusting. Only a flashlight propped inside a cracked coffee mug and the pale glow of his phone when the battery allowed it. But the ledger held him the way certain voices do when they come from very far away and still seem to know your name. Rook lay beside the workbench with his muzzle on his paws, the slow rise and fall of his breathing steady under the wind that pressed through the old boards. Every few pages the dog would sigh in his sleep, and Grant would look down at him, as if checking that at least one living thing in that room understood how strange the night had become. Silas Fenwick had begun the ledger like a man making accounts, not a man trying to be remembered. The early pages were full of weather, wood, tide, and measurements. Silas wrote about cedar, cypress, hollow bellies, fitted bottom boards, and keels set to survive rough water. Every note sounded practical, but Grant could feel something deeper hiding underneath the craft. A bird lying belly up, Silas wrote, teaches the living ones not to trust you. Grant paused over that line, thinking of all the ways a thing could lose trust by showing the wrong side of itself to the world. He wrote about paint, glass eyes, and the patience needed to make carved wood look calm on water. Never make a decoy look startled. Fear calls nothing home. Grant ran his thumb along the margin and felt, with a small discomfort, that the old carver had not been writing only about ducks. Then the names began. They appeared first as small notes beside the work. Walter Meacham sharpened the gouges today. Good hands when he remembers to breathe. Lyle Borden patched the south shelf. Paid him with 2 black ducks to sell at market. Samuel Ives came by again and said little, which is better than saying what hurts before a man is ready. Page after page the ledger widened. Silas had taken in grown men the county had stopped expecting anything from, not with speeches, not with pity. He seemed almost suspicious of pity, as if it spoiled the thing it touched. A veteran returned home silent and ashamed of needing work. Silas gave him dull chisels and let him sharpen steel until his hands stopped shaking. A boatwright whose shed went under in a storm was asked to mend the shanty door, then paid with finished decoys he could sell without admitting he had needed help. A widower who had lost his way in every ordinary sense came 3 mornings in a row and sat without lifting a tool. On the 4th morning, Silas placed a block of cedar in front of him and wrote only this. Told him to make the first cut straight. The rest can be corrected. Grant closed his eyes for a moment. The room smelled of old wood and cold oil. Outside, tidewater moved around the point, patient and unseen. He thought of the machine shop, of Dale apologizing with his cap in his hands, of people lowering their voices around him after he came home from service, as if respect and caution were the same thing. They were not. Caution kept distance. Respect came closer without trying to own the hurt. Near the middle of the ledger, one sentence had been underlined so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. A broken man does not need pity. He needs one honest task, one clean tool, and one person who still speaks to him with respect. Grant read it once, then again. His throat tightened before he understood why. There it was, written by a dead craftsman in a shanty everyone had laughed at. The thing Grant had needed for years and had never known how to ask for. Not saving, not sympathy, not a careful voice asking if he was all right. A task, a tool, a place where his hands still mattered. Rook woke and lifted his head, watching him in the flashlight glow. Grant touched the dog's ear with 2 fingers, grateful that Rook did not ask him to explain. Then he turned another page and found the name that made the air leave the room. Everett Harrow. The letters were plain, brown with age, but they might as well have been carved into Grant's chest. His grandfather. Silas had written that Everett came back from the war with no trade, no steady roof, and a look in him like a man listening for a sound no one else heard. Slept 2 nights in Dempsey's boathouse before I found him. Fed him coffee and beans, gave him cedar. He cuts too deep when ashamed, but he learns fast. Later entries showed Everett mending skiffs, carving keels, selling 3 decoys in Bracken Harbor, then taking paid work repairing small boats. Grant sat very still as the pieces settled into place. The first Harrow boat shed had not begun with ambition, as family stories claimed. It had begun here in this cold room, because Silas Fenwick had looked at a lost man and refused to call him useless. Thomas had known. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not the hidden birds behind the wall, but enough. He had bought the shanty not as a foolish old man chasing junk, but as a son paying forward a debt no receipt could hold. Grant looked around the workshop, at the bench, the birds, the wall, the dog who had found it, and felt shame move through him quietly, not to punish him, but to clear space for understanding. For 6 years he had been embarrassed by the shanty. Now he understood that without it, there might never have been a Harrow family for him to be embarrassed for. The next morning, Grant chose 3 birds with the careful hesitation of a man who did not yet know whether he was carrying treasure or trouble. He took the canvasback with the amber eyes, 1 shorebird with thin carved legs, and the black duck whose old paint held a green shine, only when the light struck it sideways. He wrapped each one in the cleanest towels he owned, the same towels he had used the night before to dry rainwater from the workbench, then slid the ledger into a plastic freezer bag from his duffel. It felt wrong to put a book like that into something so ordinary, but ordinary things had kept better men alive, and Grant had stopped mocking usefulness. Rook watched from the doorway, tail still, ears up. When Grant carried the bundles to the pickup, the dog climbed in without being called and sat straight in the passenger seat, looking ahead as if the 2 of them were not driving into town but carrying a secret through enemy weather. Bracken Harbor looked different after Heron's cut. The same shrimp boats rocked behind the same pilings. The same diner sign flickered over the same wet street. But Grant could feel the wrapped birds on the seat behind him, the way a man feels a sealed letter in his coat pocket. Tide and Timber Antiques sat between a closed barber shop and a tax office, with 2 cloudy windows full of brass lanterns, framed tide charts, old oars, and photographs of fishermen whose names had probably outlived their boats. Grant had walked past the place for years and never gone in. Shops like that had always seemed built for people with extra money and clean stories. Russell Dane, the owner, was 72, narrow-shouldered, white-haired, and quiet in a way that did not feel empty. He looked at Grant, then at Rook waiting just outside the open door, then at the towel bundle Grant placed on the counter. Grant said only that he had found something in an old family shanty and wanted to know whether it mattered. Russell unfolded the towel. For nearly a full minute he said nothing. He did not touch the canvasback right away. He bent close, eyes moving over the painted head, the combed feather lines, the fitted bottom board, the glass eyes set with that strange calm Silas had written about. Then he turned it over with 2 fingers. When he saw the SF burned inside the wing, his face changed so completely that Grant felt his stomach tighten. Russell sat down on the stool behind the counter as if his legs had asked for time. He asked where Grant got it, and Grant told him Heron's Cut, Thomas Harrow's old place. Russell removed his glasses, cleaned them though they were not dirty, and said the name Silas Fenwick as softly as some men say a prayer. He explained that Fenwick was known among serious Carolina decoy collectors, not famous in the broad way that made television people come running, but important in the smaller, harder world where men argued over paint, maker's marks, and the truth in a knife stroke. A few of Fent's working birds had survived, enough to prove his hand, enough to make people wonder about the late pieces he was rumored to have kept for himself. Those pieces, Russell said, were believed lost after a storm took part of Heron's Cut in the 1960s. Grant unwrapped the shorebird and the black duck. Russell's mouth tightened, not with greed, but with the effort of staying precise. He told Grant one bird in untouched original paint could be worth more than Grant had made in a year at the machine shop. If there were more, and if they were as clean as these, the discovery could be larger than money sounded when spoken aloud. Then Russell leaned forward, and his voice lost its wonder. "The first people who hear about this will not all come to help you," he said. "Men who buy old things know how to see fresh desperation. They will not tell you what you own. They will tell you what you fear. They do not buy the bird first. They buy the tired man holding it." Grant looked down at his hands, rough and nicked, resting beside a decoy that had slept in a wall longer than he had been alive. Russell gave him the name of Dr. Lydia Bell in Charleston, a folk art specialist who knew coastal work and did not scare easy. 3 weeks later, she came to the shanty herself, walking carefully over the shell road in rubber boots, carrying padded cases, lights, a magnifier, and the calm seriousness of someone who understood that history could be damaged by hurry. She examined all 28 birds, every signature burn, every old paint surface, every page of Silas Fenwick's ledger. When she finally sat with Grant at the workbench, Rook lying under it with his head on Grant's boot, she gave a conservative range: $450,000 to $680,000 for the collection, handled properly. Grant heard the numbers, but they seemed to pass through him before finding a place to land. Not long ago, he had counted gas money in coins. Now the thing Bracken County had laughed at could lift him out of the hole. But Dr. Bell touched the ledger with more care than she had touched any bird, and said the book might be the greater inheritance. The birds proved a master hand. The ledger proved a way of seeing people. Driving back after Russell's warning, and again after Dr. Bell left, Grant understood why that mattered. The decoys might save his life, but the ledger had already begun to change it. The story did not spread through Bracken County all at once. Things rarely did there. They moved the way tidewater moved through marsh grass, first in thin silver lines, then quietly filling every low place before anyone admitted the water had risen. It began at the diner counter, where a crabber told a mechanic that Thomas Harrow's worthless shanty had something inside it after all. It moved to the bait shop, where a woman buying hooks said the wooden ducks might be worth more than a house. It crossed the boat ramp, the post office, the feed store, and the back table at May's breakfast room, changing shape with every telling. At first, people talked only about money. They said hundreds of thousands. They said hidden art. They said Grant Harrow, of all people, had landed on a fortune by sleeping in a place everybody else had laughed at. But then Russell Dane let one name slip to someone who still had enough memory to be careful with it: Silas Fenwick. After that, the laughing thinned. Men who had been young once and were old now stopped stirring coffee. Women who had heard family stories without believing them turned their faces toward the windows. The first to come down the Shell Road was Warren Pike, 80 years old, retired boatwright, hands tremoring until they touched wood. Grant saw his truck stop short of the shanty and watched Warren sit inside for several minutes before opening the door. Rook rose from the threshold but did not bark. The old man stood in the wind, looking at the repaired tarp, the gray cypress siding, the leaning pilings beyond it, and something in his face seemed to move backward through time. "My father said he learned to hold a plane in this room," Warren said at last. "He never called Silas a saint. Said he wouldn't have trusted a saint. Said Silas was the first man in months who talked to him like he was not already finished." Grant brought him inside. The shanty had not looked like much that morning, just swept cleaner. Birds re-wrapped on the bench, ledger open under a towel to keep the damp from it. But when Grant turned the pages and found Pike, Aaron, 1951, Warren reached for the bench as if the floor had shifted. Beneath the name, Silas had written, "Steady hands when no one rushes him." Warren read it once, then again, lips pressed tight, one spotted hand resting on the paper without covering the words. He did not cry loudly. Nothing in that room asked for noise. He simply bowed his head and breathed through a grief that had waited a long time to be given permission. After Warren came Joanne Keller, who ran the Harbor Diner and had served Grant coffee for years. Her grandfather's name appeared beside a note about patching the south roof after a storm and taking 2 decoys as payment. Joanne sat in Thomas's canvas chair and laughed softly because the ledger had corrected an old family story without shaming anyone. Earl Madsen came next and found his uncle's name in the book. Others followed. Not crowds, not spectacle. 1 or 2 at a time, as marsh country people do when they suspect a place may ask them to feel more than they planned. Some brought old photographs. Some brought stories they had half dismissed as family embroidery. Some only stood in the doorway, looked at Rook lying calm on the old boards, and asked if they might see the book. Rook became part of the room's courage. He would lift his head when someone entered, study them with those dark, level eyes, then settle again if they came in gently. More than one grown man bent to touch his head before walking to the ledger, as if the dog made the past less sharp to approach. By the end of the week, people in Bracken County no longer said rotten shanty with the same easy mouth. The words caught now. They had weight, because the place they had mocked had held their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and the parts of their families that had survived only because Silas Fenwick refused to confuse hardship with worthlessness. Grant watched that change with a feeling he did not have a name for. It was not triumph. Triumph would have been smaller. It was closer to sorrow turning over and showing a clean side. He had thought the shanty belonged to him because the deed said so. Now he understood it belonged also to memory, and memory was not gentle when it woke. Every visitor left the room quieter than they entered it. Every name in the ledger seemed to place another stone on the county's conscience. The marsh outside went on bending in the wind, indifferent as ever. But inside the shanty, something long sealed had begun moving again. And with it came a question Grant could feel before anyone said it aloud. If the people who loved the past were starting to come, how long before the people who only wanted its price found the road too? The black SUV came down the Oyster Shell Road on a windless afternoon, moving too slowly for a local truck and too carefully for a man who understood mud. Grant heard it only after Rook did. The dog had been lying near the doorway while Grant worked at the rear corner of the roof, replacing a strip of torn tarpaper with a salvaged sheet of tin. Then Rook lifted his head, Not fast, not alarmed, just certain. His ears came forward and his body grew still in the way Grant had learned to trust. A few seconds later, the crunch of tires reached him across the marsh. Grant climbed down the ladder and wiped his hands on his jeans. The SUV stopped in front of the shanty without cutting the engine right away. It was too clean for Heron's cut, glossy and untouched, like it had rolled in from another world. The man who stepped out was trim, silver at the temples, and dressed too cleanly for the edge of a marsh. He smiled before he spoke, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Preston Vale, a private dealer in American sporting art and coastal folk pieces. His voice was low, polished, almost kind, like a stone made smooth by being held too often. He said he had heard a charming little story about some old duck carvings turning up in a family place, and thought he might save Grant a great deal of confusion. That word, save, landed badly. Rook stood in the doorway behind Grant, head level, watching. Preston noticed him, gave the dog a small, courteous nod, then looked past both of them into the shanty. He admired the building first. Full of character, he called it, a rare survivor, weathered in all the right ways. But his eyes did not stay on the bench, or the patched windows, or the rows of ordinary working decoys Grant had left on the open shelves. They moved once, quick and practiced, toward the inland wall where the hidden panel no longer sat flush. It was only a glance. Most men would have missed it. Grant did not. Rook did not either. The dog stepped forward and placed himself between Preston and the room, not growling, not showing teeth, only standing there with the calm weight of refusal. Preston's smile held, but something in it tightened. He began gently, the way men like him begin when they already know what they want, and have decided the other person needs to be guided into giving it. Decoys were a narrow market, he said. Auctions promised numbers they could not guarantee, and authentication could take months. Old books, while touching, often complicated a sale more than they helped it. He said all this with the patient sorrow of a man explaining weather to someone who had never been rained on. Grant listened because listening cost nothing. Preston walked no farther than the threshold, perhaps because Rook did not move. He placed one gloved hand on the doorframe and tilted his head toward the shanty, as if Grant had been living inside a problem too large for him. Then he made the offer, $40,000 for the entire group, all 28 carvings and the account book. Cash, clean paperwork, no waiting, no taxes to puzzle through alone, no strangers coming down the road. A fresh start by the weekend. The number hung in the cold room. Grant hated how quickly his mind used it. $40,000 could pay Mrs. Tallow, fix the pickup, and put him and Rook somewhere with real heat. It could cover the vet work Rook needed, and the medical appointments Grant had been postponing for too long. Preston saw the calculation. Of course he did. That was his real skill, not art, not history, hunger. He knew how long a man looked at a number when the number sounded like rescue. Grant thought of Silas's underlined sentence. A broken man does not need pity. He needs one honest task, one clean tool, and one person who still speaks to him with respect. Preston was not speaking to him with respect. Preston was speaking to the empty parts of his wallet. Grant said no, politely. Preston nodded as if he admired caution. He raised the offer to $50,000. Then, when Grant remained quiet, to $60,000. With each increase, the warmth drained from his face by a degree, leaving the shape of courtesy without its substance. At last, Preston buttoned his jacket and looked once more toward the wall Rook guarded. Old property gets complicated when money teaches people to remember it, he said. Then he stepped back into the White Shell Road, careful not to muddy his boots, and drove away toward Bracken Harbor, leaving the marsh quiet behind him. Grant stood in the doorway long after the SUV disappeared. Rook leaned his head against Grant's thigh, a solid, living weight. The offer had not frightened him. How badly he had wanted it had. And Preston's last sentence stayed in the shanty after the man was gone, moving through the room like a draft under a closed door. Money teaches people to remember. Grant looked at the ledger on the bench, at the covered birds, at the wall his father had protected without explaining, and understood that the next people who came might not come asking to buy. They might come claiming they had owned a piece of the past all along. The letter arrived 10 days after Preston Vale drove away, folded inside a white envelope too clean for the shanty. Grant found it tucked in the mailbox at the end of the Shell Road, where the postman had begun leaving things in a plastic bag weighted with a brick, because no ordinary mailbox survived long at Heron's Cut. The return address was a law office in Raleigh. He knew before he opened it that the past had learned his name again. Rook walked beside him back to the shanty, close enough that his shoulder brushed Grant's leg. Inside, Grant set the envelope on the old workbench and stood looking at it for a moment, as if paper could make noise if watched long enough. Then he opened it with his pocket knife. Clint Harrow and Anita Webb were requesting an emergency order to freeze anything discovered inside the Heron's Cut shanty. They claimed the decoys and ledger were undisclosed assets of the Harrow family estate and should be divided according to inheritance interests. Grant read the words once without understanding them, then again with the dull clarity that comes when insult finally finds its shape. Clint and Anita had laughed at Thomas. At the funeral lunch, Clint had said the shanty would fall into the marsh before it bought anybody a sandwich. Anita had told Grant, with the soft cruelty of a person pretending kindness, that some promises were just grief wearing a hat. Neither of them had paid a tax bill. Neither had driven the Shell Road. Neither had called when Grant lost the room over Mrs. Tallow's bait shop. But money had a way of improving memory. Grant sat down on the canvas chair that had belonged to his father. Rook lowered himself beneath the bench, chin on Grant's boot, eyes lifted. For several minutes, Grant felt emptied out. He had survived layoffs, bad nights, quiet rooms, the slow embarrassment of needing less than he once hoped for. But a family claim was a different kind of weather. It did not strike from outside. It found the old cracks. Russell Dane sent him to June Calder, a county lawyer with gray hair pinned back, plain shoes, and a voice that never hurried. Her office sat above a pharmacy in Bracken Harbor and smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and raincoats. Grant brought everything he had: the deed, 6 years of tax receipts, Thomas's tin box, the handwritten note, and the stack of papers he had never cared enough to read closely because pain had made him careless with his own protection. June read without speaking. She turned pages with the slow attention of someone listening to a witness who could no longer talk. Then she stopped. In the bottom of the tin box, beneath an old insurance form, was a notarized addendum signed by Thomas Harrow 4 months before his death. It was not long. June later explained that Thomas had asked for the language to be broad because he did not trust the family to leave Grant alone if the shanty ever proved valuable. Thomas had never been a long man in words, but it was clear enough to make June sit back. The property at Heron's Cut, including the land, the shanty, and all contents known or unknown, discovered or undiscovered, was granted to Grant Harrow alone. At the bottom, below the formal language, Thomas had added one sentence in his own hand. If there is something in that place I failed to explain, my son is the one I trust to understand it. Grant turned his face toward the window because the room had gone unsteady in a way he did not want anyone to see. All those years he had thought Thomas left him a burden because he could not explain himself. Now the paper said something else. Thomas had trusted him with the explanation before Grant had earned it, before Grant had even wanted it. The hearing took place in the Bracken County Courthouse on a bright morning that made the old brick building look kinder than it was. Clint and Anita arrived with a Raleigh attorney whose suit fit better than his argument. Grant came with June, Russell, Warren Pike, Joanne Keller, Earl Madsen, and a few others who had found family names in Silas Fenwick's ledger. Grant left Rook in the hallway beside a deputy, where the dog waited quietly, while the man scratched his ears and told him he looked like the only honest fellow in the building. Inside, the other attorney spoke of fairness. He said windfall, he said family, he said undisclosed property, as if repeating a phrase could make it true. June stood when he finished and did not raise her voice. She placed Thomas's addendum before the judge and read the words that mattered: known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered, to Grant Harrow alone. She noted the taxes Grant had paid, the years Clint and Anita had shown no interest, and the timing of their concern. Then she sat down, because some facts do not need decorating. The judge read the addendum twice. Her expression did not change, but the room did. The claim was denied. The property and its contents were Grant's. The court found Thomas Harrow's intent unusually specific and unmistakable. A person could not ignore a place when it was called worthless, then ask the law to remember them when it became valuable. In the hallway afterward, Clint studied the floor. Anita looked at Grant once, opened her mouth, and closed it again. Grant did not call after them. There was no sentence that would make them different people. Outside, Rook rose when he saw him and pressed his head against Grant's hand. Grant stood there under the courthouse steps, feeling the folded copy of Thomas's addendum in his jacket pocket, and understood at last. His father had not left him a mystery to punish him. He had left him trust, sealed in legal paper, waiting for the day Grant would need it most. The money came slowly, which was right, because nothing that had waited that long should have been rushed into the world. Dr. Lydia Bell handled the collection with a care that made Grant trust her, even when the numbers made him uneasy. Some of Silas Fenwick's birds were acquired by museums, where they would sit under soft lights and be studied by people who knew how to read a knife mark the way others read handwriting. Some were purchased by public collections along the coast. A few were sold to serious private collectors who wrote letters before they made offers. Letters that spoke of preservation rather than possession. Grant read everyone. He had learned from Russell Dane that the first price was not always the honest one, and he had learned from Silas that an account kept clean was its own kind of dignity. When the last sale cleared, after fees, taxes, and the careful paperwork June Calder insisted he understand before signing, Grant had about $420,000. He looked at the number on the bank statement for a long time and felt almost nothing at first. Not joy, not pride, just a quiet disbelief, as if the figure belonged to a stranger whose mail had been delivered to him by mistake. A year earlier, he had counted gas money in the ashtray of his truck. Now he could pay every debt, fix the pickup properly, replace the boots he had been patching with tape, and take Rook to a veterinarian in Wilmington who checked his hips, teeth, ears, and heart, with the seriousness Grant thought the dog deserved from the start. He did those things. He did not apologize for them. Poverty had a way of making comfort feel like theft, and Grant was learning not to confuse survival with selfishness. But after that, he came back to Heron's Cut. People expected him to leave Bracken County, maybe buy a house inland, maybe sell the shanty after all, and let the marsh take what was left. Grant understood why they thought that, Most people, when handed a way out, took it, but the shanty had never been a way out. It had been a way back. So he hired local hands where he could. Warren Pike's nephew helped raise the leaning wall. Earl Madsen brought 2 men who knew dock pilings and rebuilt the small walkway over the water. Joanne Keller sent coffee in metal jugs every morning until Grant told her she was feeding half the job site, and she said good. Some places work better when people are fed. Together they repaired the roof, replaced the windows, lifted the sagging sill, and made the floor safe again. Grant refused to sand the workbench smooth. The valleys worn into it stayed. The old blade marks stayed. The foot-powered grindstone was cleaned and oiled, not polished into a lie. The shanty was not turned into a rental, a showroom, or a pretty thing for rich people to admire from clean shoes. It remained a workshop. Silas's ledger went to the Coastal Working Craft Museum, but only after Grant made them agree to tell the whole story. Not just the decoys, not just the value, the men too. The ones who had come through the door with empty hands and left with work, steadier breath, and a reason to return the next morning. Above the case, the museum carved the line exactly as Silas had written it. A decoy is not made to fool the world. It is made to call something lost back home. Grant kept a copy of the ledger at the shanty, bound in plain black cover, and beside it he placed a new one. The first men who came after the reopening did not come easily. Men who have been disappointed by life tend to approach kindness the way marsh birds approach a blind, circling first, watching for the trick. A laid-off boatyard worker, a retired lineman who lived alone, a veteran who said little but knew how to sharpen tools until the edges caught light, a mechanic whose hands shook less when they were busy. Grant did not call them broken. He did not call them charity. He called them men who still had hands worth teaching. They learned to repair skiffs, shape cedar, restore tools, and make something that could stay upright after weather tried to turn it over. Rook lay near the door through all of it, head lifting whenever someone new stepped inside. Many of them spoke to the dog before they spoke to Grant. That seemed fair. Rook had found the wall, guarded the room when Preston Vale came, and stayed with Grant through every hard morning after. He had earned his place as the first welcome. 1 year to the day after Grant had driven to Heron's Cut with $100 and no real plan, he sat on the rebuilt step and watched the tide come in. Inside, slow blades moved through cypress. Men talked in low voices. Someone laughed once, surprised by the sound of it. Rook rested beside Grant's boot, warm and solid. Grant opened the new ledger and wrote the first line carefully. No man should have to prove he is valuable before being treated with respect. Beneath it, he wrote Grant Harrow. Then, after a pause, he wrote Rook because truth deserved accuracy. Without the dog, the wall would have stayed closed. Without the wall, Thomas would have remained misunderstood. Without Thomas, Grant might never have learned that a place could hold love better than a man could say it. The shanty glowed behind him as evening settled over the marsh. No longer a rotten mistake, no longer a joke at the end of a shell road. It held tools, work, memory, and the quiet, stubborn promise that people were worth seeing before they were useful to anyone. Grant finally understood his father. Thomas had not left him a ruin. He had left him a place that knew how to call the lost home. And for the first time in years, Grant did not feel like he was staying somewhere temporary. He was home. If this story stayed with you, like, subscribe, and tell us which moment hit you the hardest. And before you go, let us know where you're watching from tonight.